Unaware of her fortune, they abandoned their poor homeless mother to suffer folklore. The security guard's flashlight beam cut through the darkness of the parking garage, landing on a huddled figure wrapped in a threadbare blanket beside a rusted shopping cart. Margaret Chen didn't flinch. She'd grown accustomed to this routine over the past 8 months, the suspicious glances, the orders to move along, the assumption written across every face that looked her way. Worthless, disposable, invisible. "Ma'am, you can't sleep here," the guard said, his voice carrying that mixture of authority and discomfort that came from having to remove someone's grandmother from private property. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Margaret slowly pushed herself up, her 68-year-old joints protesting the concrete floor. She gathered her belongings with practiced efficiency, the worn blanket, the plastic bag containing her few possessions, the shopping cart that held everything she owned in this world. Or at least everything everyone thought she owned. "I understand," she said quietly, her voice still carrying traces of the refined accent she'd never quite lost despite decades in America. "I'll go." As she shuffled toward the exit, pushing her cart, the guard watched with visible discomfort. "There's a shelter on Maple Street," he offered, his tone softening. "They serve dinner until 9. Margaret nodded but didn't respond. She'd been to the shelters. She knew the system better than most people who'd never needed it could imagine. But tonight, like most nights, she'd sleep under the overpass on 3rd Street, where at least she could maintain some semblance of dignity and solitude. What the security guard didn't know, what nobody in this city knew except Margaret's lawyer and her banker, was that the woman he'd just ejected from the parking garage had $60 million sitting in various accounts and investments, accumulating interest with every passing second. $60 million that she refused to touch. $60 million that might as well not exist. Because for Margaret Chen, money had always been both a blessing and a curse. And 8 months ago, it had become the reason she'd lost everything that truly mattered. Part 2. Background set up the story of how Margaret Chen ended up homeless began, ironically, with her becoming wealthy. 35 years earlier, Margaret had arrived in San Francisco from Hong Kong with her husband David, their life savings of $8,000 and dreams of building something meaningful. David had a degree in engineering. Margaret had studied business. Together, they opened a small electronics repair shop in the Sunset District, working 16-hour days, sleeping on a cot in the back room, eating nothing but rice and vegetables to save money. Their children were born in that shop, Thomas first, then 3 years later Jennifer, and finally, 5 years after that, Michael. The kids grew up surrounded by circuit boards and soldering irons, doing homework on the counter between customers, learning the value of hard work and perseverance. "Education is everything," Margaret would tell them, repeating it like a mantra. "Work hard, save money, build a secure future, that's what matters." David died when Michael was only 12, a sudden heart attack at 47, right there in the shop. Margaret was devastated, but she couldn't afford to fall apart. She had 3 children to raise, a business to run, and no time for grief. She worked even harder, pushed the children even more, saved every possible penny. "Your father would want you to succeed," she'd say whenever they complained about the long hours or the lack of fun in their lives. "Everything I do is for your future." Thomas became a software engineer, graduating from Berkeley with honors. Jennifer went to medical school, becoming a dermatologist. Michael followed Thomas into tech, landing a job at a promising startup. Margaret was proud they'd achieved the American dream she and David had envisioned. But there was a distance there, a coolness in their interactions that Margaret noticed but didn't know how to address. They called dutifully on holidays. They sent cards. They came to obligatory Sunday dinners, but there was no warmth, no real connection. They'd spent their childhoods working in the shop, studying at the counter, hearing constantly about sacrifice and responsibility. They'd succeeded, yes. But somewhere along the way, they'd learned to associate their mother with pressure, expectations, and an endless litany of what they should do better. Then, 5 years ago, everything changed. Margaret had always been cautious with money, investing conservatively in index funds and bonds. But on a whim, perhaps the only truly spontaneous decision she'd made in decades, she invested $50,000 in Michael's startup. He'd mentioned it casually over Sunday dinner, not really expecting her to contribute. But she believed in him even if she had trouble showing it. 3 years later, that startup went public. Margaret's $50,000 investment became worth $62 million overnight. At first, she was thrilled. She told the children immediately, expecting them to be happy for her, to celebrate this incredible stroke of fortune. She imagined finally being able to relax, to perhaps build the relationships she'd sacrificed while focusing on financial security. The reaction was not what she expected. 62 million, Thomas had repeated, his voice flat. You have $62 million. Can you believe it? Margaret had laughed, still giddy with disbelief. All from that little investment in Michael's company. The silence that followed was deafening. Jennifer spoke first. You had $50,000 just sitting around to invest. I saved it over the years, Margaret explained, confused by their tone. I was very careful with money. Careful, Thomas repeated. Right, so careful that we all worked in that shop from the time we could count change. So careful that I wore the same 3 shirts throughout high school because you said we couldn't afford new clothes. So careful that Jenny couldn't do ballet because the lessons were too expensive. I was providing for your future, Margaret started, while sitting on $50,000 that you could invest on a whim. Jennifer's voice rose. Do you have any idea what that feels like, Mom? Finding out that all those years of we can't afford it and we have to save every penny were apparently negotiable. It wasn't negotiable, Margaret protested. I was being responsible. I was making sure we had security. You were being controlling, Michael said quietly. Everything was always about money with you, about saving, about security, about the future, never about just living, never about being happy. I wanted you to have opportunities. We wanted a mother, Thomas said. Not a financial advisor, not a drill sergeant, a mother. The conversation had deteriorated from there. They left angry. The Sunday dinners stopped. The holiday calls became brief and perfunctory. Margaret tried to reach out, tried to explain, but the hurt had apparently been festering for years, and her sudden wealth had simply ripped the bandage off a wound that had never properly healed. She tried to make amends. She offered money for down payments on houses, for their children's education funds, for anything they needed. But that only made things worse. So now you want to buy a relationship? Jennifer had said coldly. Now that you have more money than you could ever spend, now you want to play the generous mother. That's not what I'm doing. It's exactly what you're doing. Money is all you understand, Mom. It's all you've ever understood. Over the next 2 years, the distance grew. The calls stopped entirely. Margaret sent gifts for her grandchildren's birthdays, expensive gifts, because she didn't know what else to do, and received polite, impersonal thank you notes. She attended Michael's wedding but sat alone, feeling like a stranger at her own son's celebration. She tried everything she could think of. She wrote letters, sent emails, showed up at their houses. But they were busy. They had their own lives. They'd made their peace with having a mother who had provided for them financially but had never really been there emotionally. And now that she wanted to change that, it was too late. Part 3, Gradual Degradation. The final rupture came on a Sunday afternoon in March, 2 years after Margaret had become wealthy. She'd invited all 3 children and their families to the house for dinner, the house she'd bought with her newfound wealth, a beautiful Victorian in Pacific Heights that she'd hoped would become a gathering place for the family. She'd spent days preparing their favorite dishes, setting the table with her best china, arranging flowers in every room. Thomas arrived first with his wife Rachel and their 2 teenage daughters. The girls were absorbed in their phones. Rachel offered a tight smile. Thomas looked around the dining room with barely concealed disdain. This must have cost a fortune, he said, gesturing at the renovated space. I wanted to make a nice home for family gatherings, Margaret replied, trying to keep her voice light. Somewhere we could all be together. Right, because that's what we were missing, a bigger house. Jennifer arrived next with her husband Paul and their 8-year-old son. She looked tired, immediately declining the wine Margaret offered. Long week? Margaret asked, trying to make conversation. Always is, Jennifer said shortly. Michael was last, apologizing for his tardiness. His wife Sandra seemed uncomfortable, glancing between Michael and his siblings as if trying to read the room's temperature. Dinner was tense. Margaret tried to ask about their lives but received monosyllabic answers. She attempted to share stories about their father but was met with silence. Finally, desperate to break through the wall of coldness, she brought up something she'd been planning. I've been thinking, she began, her hands clasped nervously on the table. I want to set up trust funds for all the grandchildren, for their education, their futures. I know I can't change the past, but I can help secure. Here we go again, Thomas interrupted, throwing his napkin on the table. Everything's about money with you. I'm trying to help. You're trying to assuage your guilt, Jennifer cut in. You're trying to buy absolution for being an absent mother. I was never absent. I was there every single day working to provide. Physically there, Michael said quietly. But that's all. You were so focused on building financial security that you never stopped to actually be with us, to know us, to love us. Of course I loved you. Everything I did was because I loved you. Loved us. Jennifer's voice shook. You loved the idea of successful children. You loved being able to say your kids went to good schools and got good jobs. But did you ever once ask what we wanted? What would make us happy? Margaret felt her chest tightening. I gave you everything. You gave us money and pressure, Thomas said, standing up. That's all you've ever given us, and now you're rich and you think that somehow makes up for 30 years of emotional neglect. That's not fair. Fair? Jennifer stood as well. Want to talk about fair? You know what wasn't fair? Being 8 years old and having to work the register because you couldn't afford to hire help, even though apparently you had savings sitting around. You know what wasn't fair? Never having a real conversation with you that didn't revolve around grades or work or money. I was doing my best, Margaret's voice cracked. Your father died, I had 3 children, a business barely making ends meet. And you made sure we never forgot it, Thomas said. Every day it was about sacrifice and responsibility and securing the future. You never once just held us, played with us, asked us about our dreams that didn't involve financial success. The room fell silent except for the sound of Margaret's ragged breathing. The grandchildren looked uncomfortable. Sandra was studying her plate. Rachel had her arms crossed. I think we should go, Michael said softly. Please, Margaret whispered. Please don't leave. We can talk about this. We've tried talking, Jennifer said, gathering her purse. You don't listen, you've never listened. All you hear is criticism of your precious work ethic, your sacrifices. You can't accept that maybe, just maybe, we needed more than financial security. They left one family at a time. Margaret stood in her expensive dining room, surrounded by untouched food and cold silence, and felt something break inside her. Over the next few months, she tried calling. Calls went to voicemail. She tried visiting, they were busy. She sent letters, long letters, pouring out her heart, trying to explain her choices, trying to bridge the gap. She received nothing in return. Her lawyer, Robert Chen, no relation, called her for their quarterly financial review. Your investments are doing well, he reported. You're up to 67 million. Have you given any thought to estate planning, setting up trusts for your children? They don't want my money, Margaret said flatly. Nevertheless, you should. They don't want anything from me, she interrupted. They've made that perfectly clear. Robert was quiet for a moment. Margaret, if you don't mind my saying so, you seem depressed. Have you considered speaking to someone? I've considered many things, she replied. What she was considering, specifically, was what her life had become. She'd spent decades building financial security, and for what? She lived alone in a house too big for one person, with more money than she could spend in 3 lifetimes and no one to share it with. The grandchildren were growing up without knowing her. Her children had written her off as nothing more than a difficult, money-obsessed woman who'd failed at the one job that truly mattered. She thought about David constantly. Would he be proud of what she'd built, or disappointed by what she'd lost? The depression deepened. She stopped answering Robert's calls. She stopped going out. The beautiful house became a prison, every room echoing with the absence of family, every expensive furnishing a reminder that she'd chosen the wrong things to value. One night, sitting alone in her bedroom, Margaret made a decision. It wasn't rational, and she knew it. But rationality had got her wealth and loneliness. Maybe irrationality would teach her and her children something different. She packed a single bag with a few clothes, some photos, and her most treasured possession, a worn notebook containing recipes written in David's handwriting. She withdrew $500 in cash from an ATM. Then she walked out of the Pacific Heights Victorian and kept walking. She didn't take her phone. She didn't take credit cards. She left behind the bank statements, the investment portfolios, the checkbooks. She left behind everything that had come to define her. She wanted to understand what it meant to have nothing. She wanted her children to see what happened when you stripped away the money they claimed was all she cared about. She wanted them to realize, when she was gone, that she'd been more than just a wealthy woman trying to buy affection. Maybe it was a test. Maybe it was a punishment for them or herself, she wasn't sure. Maybe it was simply a desperate woman's desperate attempt to make sense of a life that had somehow gone completely wrong despite all her careful planning. She told no one, not Robert, not her children. She simply vanished into the city, becoming one of the thousands of invisible people who lived on the streets, and waited to see if anyone would care enough to look for her. Part 4, Discovery Phase ***. 8 months later, on a cold November evening, Thomas Chen sat in his home office reviewing quarterly reports when his wife Rachel appeared in the doorway. Have you talked to your mother lately? She asked. Thomas didn't look up from his laptop. Not in the past few months. Why? I just thought, it's almost Thanksgiving. I know things have been strained, but shouldn't you at least call? She knows how to reach me if she wants to talk. Rachel was quiet for a moment. Thomas, I know she hurt you. I know your childhood was difficult, but she's 68 years old and she's alone. Don't you think? She made her choices, Thomas said, his voice hard. She chose money and work over being a real mother. Now she gets to live with those choices. That seems harsh. It's reality. He finally looked up at his wife. You didn't grow up with her, Rachel. You don't know what it was like. Every conversation, every interaction, it all came back to money and success and providing for the future. She never just loved us, not unconditionally. It was always transactional. People can change. She's had 68 years. I'm not holding my breath. Rachel sighed and left him to his work, but her words nagged at him. He hadn't spoken to his mother in 5 months, not since she'd sent his daughters expensive birthday gifts that felt more like obligations than genuine gestures. He'd sent a brief thank you text. She'd replied with, "You're welcome, I miss you all." He hadn't responded. That weekend, at his daughter Emily's soccer game, Thomas ran into an old family friend, Mrs. Liu, who had owned the shop next to his mother's repair business years ago. "Thomas, so good to see you." Mrs. Liu embraced him warmly. "How is your mother? I haven't seen her in ages." "She's fine," Thomas said automatically. "Keeping busy." "Oh, that's good." "I was worried when I heard she'd sold the house." Thomas froze. "What? The Pacific Heights house? Someone told me it sold last spring. I thought maybe she'd moved somewhere warmer, retired properly. She certainly has the money for it now." Thomas managed to keep smiling until Mrs. Liu moved on to greet other people. Then he pulled out his phone and called Jennifer. "Did you know Mom sold her house?" he demanded when she answered. "What? No, when?" "Apparently last spring. Mrs. Liu just told me." "That doesn't make sense. Why wouldn't she tell us?" "Because we're not speaking to her, maybe." Thomas felt a pang of something he didn't want to identify as guilt. "She could have called. She has our numbers." "Yeah, and we'd have answered." Thomas rubbed his face. "I don't know, Jen. This feels weird. Where is she living?" "How should I know? Call Michael. Maybe he knows." Michael didn't know. In fact, Michael hadn't spoken to their mother in 6 months, not since she'd sent a birthday card for his wife Sandra that had included a check for $5,000, a gesture that felt more insulting than generous. The 3 siblings had a conference call that evening. "So none of us have talked to her in months," Jennifer summarized. "And apparently she sold her house and didn't tell any of us. Don't you think that's concerning?" "Maybe she moved and didn't want to deal with our judgment," Thomas suggested, but he didn't sound convinced. "You know how she gets. Everything's private, everything's about maintaining control." "Or maybe something's wrong," Michael said quietly. "Like what?" "I don't know, but think about it. When has Mom ever made a major decision without analyzing it from every possible angle? Selling that house just months after buying it. That's not like her." "People change," Thomas said, echoing Rachel's words. "Maybe she finally decided to enjoy her money instead of hoarding it." But doubt had crept in. That night, Thomas tried calling his mother's cell phone. It went straight to voicemail, her message brief and formal. "You've reached Margaret Chen. Please leave a message." "Hey, Mom, it's Thomas, just checking in. Call me back when you get a chance." She didn't call back. He tried again the next day and the day after that. So did Jennifer and Michael. All the calls went to voicemail. Thomas called Robert Chen, whose contact information he remembered from his mother's mentions. "Mr. Chen, this is Thomas Chen, Margaret's son. I'm trying to reach my mother, but she's not answering her phone. Has she contacted you recently?" There was a long pause on the line. "I'm not sure I should discuss your mother's affairs without her permission. I'm not asking about her finances. I just need to know if she's okay. She's not returning calls, and we heard she sold her house." Another pause. "I haven't heard from your mother in approximately 8 months. Thomas felt his stomach drop. 8 months, but isn't that unusual? Don't you handle her investments?" "I do, but Mrs. Chen stopped returning my calls last spring. I've been managing her portfolio as per our standing agreement, but I haven't been able to reach her for quarterly reviews." "And you didn't think to follow up? Report her missing?" "She's an adult, Mr. Chen. She has the right to privacy. I assumed she simply wanted to be left alone for a while. People with significant wealth sometimes need space from financial advisors." "But 8 months. I sent letters to her residence. They were returned. The house sold, as you apparently know. I've had no further contact information." After the call ended, Thomas sat staring at his phone. 8 months. Their mother had been unreachable for 8 months, and none of them had noticed because they'd all been too angry, too hurt, too wrapped up in their own grievances to check on her. He called Jennifer back. "Robert Chen hasn't heard from her in 8 months. The letters he sent were returned." "Thomas, I'm starting to get scared." "Me too." They filed a missing person report. The police were sympathetic but not particularly concerned. "Your mother is an adult," the officer explained. "She has the right to go wherever she wants without telling anyone. Was there any indication she might harm herself?" "No, but any signs of dementia or cognitive decline?" "She's only 68 and she was sharp as ever the last time we saw her." "Well, we'll make a note and keep an eye out, but unless there's evidence of foul play or incapacity, there's not much we can do." Lots of people choose to go off the grid for various reasons. Thomas wanted to scream that his mother wouldn't just go off the grid, that she was too cautious, too responsible. But then he remembered the look on her face the last time he'd seen her, standing in that expensive dining room while her children walked out. Maybe she was exactly the type to go off the grid. Maybe they'd driven her to it. If you're finding this story compelling, please consider subscribing to the channel. Stories like this take time and care to craft, and your support helps us continue creating content that makes you think and feel. Jennifer started searching in earnest. She called hospitals, checked social services, contacted every friend and acquaintance of their mothers that she could remember. Most of them hadn't seen Margaret in months. Some had tried calling and gotten no response. One mentioned that Margaret had seemed depressed the last time they'd spoken, distant and distracted. Michael went to the Pacific Heights house. The new owners were a young couple who'd bought it through a real estate agent. They'd never met Margaret. The house had been empty when they purchased it, nothing left behind except a few pieces of furniture and some cleaning supplies. It was like someone just walked away from their whole life, the new owner said. The realtor mentioned the seller was motivated, wanted to close quickly. We got a good deal. Michael walked through the neighborhood asking shopkeepers and neighbors if they'd seen his mother. An elderly man 3 houses down remembered her. Nice lady, he said. Quiet, kept to herself. I used to see her sitting on the porch sometimes, always alone. She looked sad, if you want my honest opinion. Stopped seeing her around March or April, I think. Did you notice anything unusual before she left? The man thought about it. Come to think of it, yeah. She used to have groceries delivered every week, regular as clockwork. Then one week the delivery guy left bags on the porch. They sat there all day. I almost went over to check on her, but then someone came and took them. Thought maybe she'd been out of town. Never saw her again after that. The guilt was beginning to crush Thomas. Every night he lay awake thinking about those last words he'd said to his mother, about the coldness in his voice, the finality with which he'd walked out. He'd wanted her to suffer a little, wanted her to understand how it felt to be alone. But he'd never imagined she might actually disappear. He'd never imagined he might lose the chance to fix things. Jennifer was having similar thoughts, made worse by her medical training. She kept imagining scenarios, her mother lying in a hospital somewhere with no ID, suffering from amnesia, or worse. The rational part of her brain said it was unlikely. The guilty part said it was exactly what she deserved for abandoning her mother when she was clearly in distress. Michael started tracking financial records, something he'd learned how to do in his tech career. With Robert Chen's reluctant assistance, they confirmed that their mother hadn't touched any of her accounts in 8 months. No withdrawals except automatic bill payments that had stopped when the house sold. No credit card activity. No trace of her anywhere in the financial system. Like she vanished, Michael reported to his siblings, completely off the grid. People don't just vanish, Jennifer said, her voice tight with stress. Not people with $67 million, not without a reason. Maybe that's exactly why she vanished, Thomas said slowly. Maybe she wanted to get away from the money, from everything it represented. What do you mean? Think about it. The last real conversation we had with her, we basically accused her of caring about nothing but money. Of being incapable of real emotion, real connection. What if she decided to prove us wrong? What if she walked away from all of it? That's insane, Jennifer protested. She wouldn't just abandon everything, wouldn't she? Thomas challenged. We abandoned her. We cut her out of our lives because we were hurt and angry. What if this is her way of showing us what that feels like? Or worse, what if she's trying to show us who she is without the money? The thought hung in the air, heavy and damning. They hired a private investigator, a woman named Sarah Martinez who specialized in finding missing persons. She was thorough, professional, and after 2 weeks of investigation, she had disturbing news. Your mother withdrew $500 in cash on March 15th from an ATM in the Marina District, Sarah reported, showing them the transaction record she'd obtained. That was the last time she used any banking services. Her phone was last pinged by a cell tower in the Tenderloin on March 16th, then it went dark. After that, nothing, no trace. The Tenderloin? Jennifer looked sick. That's one of the worst neighborhoods in the city. It's also where a lot of homeless services are concentrated, Sarah said gently. Shelters, food banks, that sort of thing. You think our mother is homeless? Thomas couldn't wrap his mind around it. That's impossible. She has millions, she has access to millions, Sarah corrected. But if she's not using that access, then effectively she has nothing. I've been checking with shelters, showing her photo. Several staff members think they might have seen her, but no one's certain. Homeless populations are transient, and people don't always give their real names. Oh my God, Jennifer whispered. This is really happening. We need to find her, Michael said firmly. Whatever it takes. Part 5, set up the search intensified. The three siblings took time off work and divided the city into sections. They walked the streets of the Tenderloin, the Mission, the neighborhoods where San Francisco's homeless population concentrated. They showed Margaret's photo to anyone who would look. They visited every shelter, every soup kitchen, every place that served the city's most vulnerable residents. It was eye-opening and heartbreaking. Thomas had driven past homeless people thousands of times in his life, barely registering them as individuals. Now he looked into each face, wondering if one of them might know his mother. He listened to their stories, veterans with PTSD, people with mental illness, families who'd lost everything in a medical crisis, people who'd simply had a run of bad luck and fallen through society's cracks. "You her son?" An older man asked when Thomas showed him Margaret's photo at a soup kitchen in the Tenderloin. She talked about her son sometimes, and her daughter. Thomas's heart leaped. "You've seen her, you know her. Maggie, sure I know Maggie, sweet lady, quiet, keeps to herself mostly, but she's got a kind heart, shared her food with me more than once when I was having a rough day." "Where is she? Where can I find her?" The man shrugged. "Haven't seen her in a few days, people come and go, you know. But she usually sleeps under the overpass on 3rd Street, sometimes in the parking garage on Mission until they kick her out. Check there maybe." Thomas felt like he'd been punched. His mother sleeping under an overpass, his mother being kicked out of parking garages, the woman who'd worked herself to exhaustion to provide for them, reduced to begging for meals and searching for safe places to sleep. Is she okay? Is she sick?" "She seems all right physically. But she's sad, you know. Got this look in her eyes like she's lost something important. I figured it was family, that's usually what that look means. People out here, they end up here because they lost family or family lost them." The man's words struck Thomas like a physical blow. "If you see her, will you tell her? Tell her Thomas is looking for her, that all her kids are looking for her." "I'll tell her if I see her. But Thomas, if she's been out here 8 months and she's got family looking for her, maybe she doesn't want to be found. Maybe she's got her reasons for being where she is." Thomas found Jennifer and Michael and reported what he'd learned. They headed to 3rd Street, to the overpass the man had mentioned. It was evening and the temperature was dropping. Dozens of people had set up camp under the concrete structure, tents, shopping carts, makeshift shelters constructed from cardboard and tarps. They walked slowly through the encampment, showing Margaret's photo, asking if anyone had seen her. Most people shook their heads or didn't respond. Then a young woman holding a sleeping toddler looked at the photo and nodded. "Maggie, yeah, she helped me once when Jamie was sick, gave me her blankets, showed me where to get baby medicine at the free clinic. She's a good person." "Do you know where she is?" "She was here earlier today, but she left. Sometimes she goes to the library when it's open. She likes to read there. Stays warm, you know." They tried the library, but the staff hadn't seen anyone matching Margaret's description that day. They returned to the overpass, but Margaret didn't appear. They came back the next day and the next, searching the places where the homeless man had said she might be. On the 4th day, Jennifer spotted her. She was sitting on a bench in a small park near the Civic Center, wrapped in a worn jacket, her hair grayer than Jennifer remembered, her face thinner. She was reading a tattered paperback, completely absorbed in it. Jennifer's first instinct was to run over to embrace her mother, to sob with relief, but something stopped her. Instead, she called Thomas and Michael, and the three of them watched their mother from a distance, trying to understand what they were seeing. This wasn't a woman in crisis. This wasn't someone disoriented or confused. Margaret sat peacefully on that bench, reading her book, occasionally looking up to watch the pigeons. She looked tired, certainly, older, but there was a calmness to her that Jennifer hadn't seen in years. "What is she doing?" Michael whispered. "Why is she living like this?" "Maybe," Thomas said slowly. "The better question is, what are we going to do?" They were still debating when Margaret stood up, gathered her few possessions into a shopping cart parked beside the bench, and began walking. They followed at a distance, watching as she made her way to a soup kitchen, stood in line with dozens of others, received a meal, and sat down to eat at a communal table. She chatted with the people around her, smiled at something someone said, helped an elderly man who was struggling with his tray. "She looks—" Jennifer trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "Content," Thomas supplied. "She looks content." It was true. Despite the circumstances, despite living on the street, despite having nothing, Margaret looked more at peace than she had in the expensive Pacific Heights house. They continued watching her for 3 more days, trying to understand, trying to figure out the right approach. They saw her help a young mother with a baby. They saw her share food with others. They saw her slip a few dollars, probably from that original $500, to a man who was crying because he couldn't buy insulin. They saw her read to a group of children at a community center, her face animated in a way they rarely remembered from their childhood. "She's not just surviving out here," Michael observed. "She's living maybe for the first time in decades." "But it's not safe," Jennifer protested. "She could get hurt or sick. It's November, winter's coming, and she doesn't have to live like this. She has $67 million. "She knows that," Thomas said. "She chose this. The question is why." The answer came from an unexpected source. Sarah Martinez, the private investigator, called with information she'd uncovered. "I've been digging into your mother's activities before she disappeared," Sarah said. "I found something interesting. In the weeks before she left, she made several donations, large ones, $2 million to homeless services, $1 million to food banks, $500,000 to affordable housing initiatives. She set up a scholarship fund for underprivileged students. She endowed a community center. All told, she gave away about $8 million. Why?" Thomas asked, though he was beginning to understand. "I can't say for certain, but the pattern suggests someone trying to make amends or someone trying to understand something they didn't before." After Sarah hung up, the three siblings sat in Thomas's car, parked where they could see the overpass where their mother slept. "She gave away $8 million trying to help the homeless," Jennifer said. "And then she became one of them. She's trying to understand," Michael said, "trying to feel what it's like to have nothing. Or proving a point," Thomas added, "showing us that she's more than just money, that she can exist without it, that she can be generous and kind and connected without wealth defining her." "Even if that's true," Jennifer said, "we can't just let her stay out here. We have to talk to her, bring her home." "Do we?" Thomas looked at his sister. "What if bringing her home, bringing her back to that life is the last thing she wants? What if this is the first time she's felt free in decades? She's homeless, Thomas. By choice, she has access to millions and she's choosing to live with nothing. Maybe we need to understand why before we decide what to do." They agreed to approach her the next day to finally have the conversation they'd been avoiding. But as they were planning what to say, Jennifer's phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize. "Hello. Is this Jennifer Chen, Margaret Chen's daughter?" "Yes, who is this?" "This is San Francisco General Hospital. Your mother was brought in about an hour ago. She's stable, but you should come." Jennifer's blood ran cold. "What happened?" "She collapsed at a shelter, exposure and malnutrition primarily. She's responding to treatment, but she's quite weak. The hospital staff recognized her from the missing person report. Can you come? We'll be right there." Part 6, climactic reversal asterisk. They rushed to the hospital, fear and guilt and relief all tangled together. A nurse directed them to a room in the emergency department. Through the door's window, they could see their mother lying in a hospital bed, looking small and frail, an IV in her arm, monitors beeping steadily. "You can go in," the nurse said, "but try not to overwhelm her. She needs rest." They entered quietly. Margaret's eyes were closed. She looked so much older than the last time they'd seen her, the lines in her face deeper, her hair completely gray. But she was breathing steadily, and as they gathered around her bed, her eyes fluttered open. For a long moment, no one spoke. Margaret looked at each of her children in turn, her expression unreadable. Finally, Thomas broke the silence. "Mom, we've been looking everywhere for you." Margaret's voice was hoarse from disuse. "Have you?" "For weeks," Jennifer added. "We were so worried." "Why didn't you tell us you were leaving? Why didn't you let us know you were okay?" "Would you have answered if I'd called?" Margaret asked simply. The question hung in the air, unanswerable because they all knew the truth. No, they probably wouldn't have, not 8 months ago when they were still too angry, too hurt. "That's not fair," Michael said. "You can't just disappear and then blame us for not staying in touch." "I'm not blaming anyone," Margaret said. She sounded tired but not angry. "I'm simply stating facts. We weren't speaking. I needed to understand some things." "By becoming homeless," Jennifer's voice rose. "By endangering your health, that's how you chose to understand things?" Margaret was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. When she spoke, her voice was stronger. "When your father died, I was terrified. I had 3 children, a struggling business, and no idea how we'd survive. So I did the only thing I knew how to do. I worked. I saved every penny. I built security. And I told myself that if I could just provide for you, give you opportunities, that would be enough. That would be love." She paused, her eyes distant with memory. "But somewhere along the way, providing became my entire identity. Money became how I showed love because I didn't know any other way. Work became my refuge from feelings I didn't know how to process. And you children, you became my project, my proof that all the sacrifice meant something." "Mom," Thomas started, but she held up a hand. "Let me finish. I need to say this." She took a breath. "That last dinner when you all said I'd never really been a mother, that I only cared about money, it destroyed me because you were right. I had provided financially but failed emotionally, and the worst part was that I had no idea how to fix it, how to be different. So you decided to live on the street?" Jennifer asked, disbelief in her voice. I decided to strip away the one thing that had defined me for so long, the money. I wanted to understand who I was without it. I wanted to see if I could connect with people when I had nothing to offer but myself. And I wanted. She paused, her voice breaking. I wanted you to see me, not my bank account, not my sacrifices, just me. That's crazy, Michael said, but his voice was soft, not accusing. Maybe, probably, but it's what I needed to do. Margaret looked at each of them. I met people out there who had nothing, who'd lost everything, and they still helped each other. Shared food, shared warmth, shared stories. They saw me not as a wealthy woman or a demanding mother, but just as Maggie, another person struggling to get by. And for the first time in my life, I felt seen. She pressed on, needing them to understand. I read to children who didn't care that I once ran a business. I helped a young mother who didn't know about my investment portfolio. I listened to an old veteran's stories, and he listened to mine, and we were just two people being human together. No transactions, no expectations, just connection. But you could have died, Jennifer whispered. You almost did die. I know, Margaret smiled faintly. Turns out 68 is too old to sleep under bridges in November. Who knew? It's not funny, Mom. No, it's not, but it's also not as tragic as you think. She looked at them seriously. I have $67 million. I could buy comfort, security, anything I want. But I've learned that money can't buy the things that actually matter. It can't buy genuine connection. It can't buy the feeling of being seen for who you really are. It can't buy forgiveness or healing or love. So what was the plan? Thomas asked. Just live on the streets until we found you, until we understood your point. I didn't have a plan, Margaret admitted. I just knew I couldn't keep living the way I was, alone in an expensive house, with all the money in the world and no one to share life with. I needed to break something to force a change, even if that meant breaking myself in the process. The machines beeped. The hospital bustled with activity outside their room, and the four of them sat in silence, the weight of 8 months and 30 years settling between them. Finally, Thomas spoke, his voice thick with emotion. I'm sorry. Margaret looked at him, surprised. I'm sorry, he repeated, for what I said that last night, for cutting you out, for being so angry that I couldn't see you were hurting too, for not realizing that you'd been hurting for a long time. Thomas, no, let me say this. He moved closer to the bed. You weren't a perfect mother. You were emotionally distant. You did make everything about work and money. But you were also a widow at 40 with 3 kids and a failing business, and you did the best you knew how. And instead of trying to understand that, instead of trying to bridge the gap, I just wrote you off. I decided you were incapable of change, incapable of real emotion. I was wrong. Jennifer was crying now. We all were. We blamed you for not being the mother we wanted, but we never tried to know.